Well, welcome to week 2 of Global Ethics. I am Dr. Thibault. This is the first time you're seeing me on video, so nice to meet you all. I just want to make some quick videos week to week, particularly when we are dealing with some of the ethical theories. This week we're really not dealing with one of the normative ethical theories, but we are dealing with the issues of universalism versus relativism. So I think that this might be a new concept for some people, so it'd be worth taking some time to talk about. So I will just address some of these in kind of as quickly as I can, but we'll give a little bit of backstory too. Just so you know too, and behind me are all of the philosophers which we will be looking at throughout this semester. So you'll start to see some of these guys and gals as they pop up throughout the next several weeks, right? So I think that will be enjoyable to see at the end that you actually know who these people are. So right now you probably recognize maybe this guy here, Aristotle, but the rest might be a little bit less common. So we're dealing with global ethics. So this is a question that comes up a lot in the quiz this week, and it's a question that I have a lot about this class as well. So one of the big questions I have with global ethics is how exactly is it global, right? How is it global? Because we used to have business ethics and then we changed it so it became global ethics, which sounds great, but I'm going to go back a slide to look at our philosophers. If you look at our philosophers, you might be able to see some commonality among our philosophers. I'll give you a second. They're all white, right? They're all white. So global ethics only from a Western perspective in some ways, right? We go as far east as Aristotle here, and we go as far west. Let's see. We don't go very far west at all. Aldo Leopold, who lived in the mid states of the United States. Carol Gilligan is in Cambridge. Rawls is Cambridge. Nozick is Cambridge. Ayn Rand came from Russia, but she spent a lot of time kind of a New Yorker. So even as far west as only the United States, and even then mostly the east coast of the United States, and only as far east as Greece, and only as far south as New York. So nothing from Latin America, nothing from Africa or Asia or the Middle East even. So in some ways it's not global in that regard. So how then is it global? And it's kind of a Western philosophical perspective of global issues. So we're dealing with globalization in terms of trade, commerce, ethical issues. Where do our clothes come from? Where do our food come from? Often outside of the Western world. We might live in the Western world, but a lot of times we're very dependent on things outside of the Western world. So we're dealing with globalization. We're dealing with global issues of famine or disease or the pandemic, for example, right? Just because something begins in one country doesn't mean it remains in one country. It's something very important during a pandemic to realize. So we are dealing with global issues in a global global world, but we're really dealing with it from a Western framing. And I think that's probably the shortcoming of this class. That said, I don't think that there are any books written that I can find that are global ethics books written from global ethical perspectives. And I think probably you can have your own opinion on this, but I think some of the bias why we don't have many why we don't have many global ethics books that are really written from a global ethics perspective is we've been very informed by the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment in Europe was about being rational, to separate out superstition, to separate out faith or religion, spirituality, the divine or God from ethics, to have an ethics that's completely humanistic. And I think once we move outside of the United States and Europe to ethical theories, it's far less atheistic, right? If you were to look at ethics from various African perspectives, I think you would have the divine very integrated within ethical theories. Also, I spent quite a bit of time in Latin America. I think, it would be far more religious minded than the Enlightenment philosophers, especially Eastern Asia. There's quite a bit as well. If you think of Thailand or Singapore, places like that, Vietnam. I think if we were to try to become global, we would have to consider a lot of theological elements as well, and we don't get into that. So it's kind of aimed globally, more from an economics lens than from the ethics of everyday people in everyday life. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but on reflecting upon it, I think that's where I stand on it. We are looking at primarily normative theories of ethics. Normative theories of ethics are ethics where they tell you what you ought to do. So we will look at a half a dozen normative theories of ethics: utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, ethics of care. These different ethical theories tell us what we ought to do. Now, we have all these different lenses, right? It's like having 6 parents. They each tell you what to do, but in a different way, right? Mother and father might not say it exactly the same way, right? They might both have authority, but they might say different things depending on who you ask, right? Same thing with the normative theories of ethics. We're not just going to study one way to do ethics. We will study a pluralistic way of doing ethics, but each one of those theories will tell us what we ought to do. There's also ethical theories like applied ethics, which could be something like business ethics or medical ethics, right? These are very specific to a particular field. We're not looking at a particular field, we're looking at general, so we're not getting much into applied ethics. There's also descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics is the study of what people actually think. So if you were to say, well, what do people think about the abortion issue, right? You could do a survey, and you could say 75% of people say this, and 25% of people say that, which is very interesting, right? It's interesting, but it doesn't actually tell you if something is ethical or not. It just tells you what people think about it. That's called descriptive ethics. What do you think about it? And lastly, there's a field called metaethics, which asks the bigger question, like, who am I? What is truth? What is being? What does it mean to be alive? Right? These bigger questions, kind of maybe Plato or some of the Greeks. They focus a lot on those bigger questions. We won't be focusing too heavily into that. We are doing more normative theories of ethics. How do I live an ethical life? That's the bigger question we're asking. Sometimes you see that normative theory of ethics. It might pop up in quiz. It's just saying ethical theories that we're studying. That's what it means. A big question that comes up with this section, we're going to get into now the universalism versus relativism. When we think of these two ideas, universalism, you can hear right in the term universalism this idea of universal, right? So a universal theory would be one that says it doesn't matter what century I'm living in, it's the same. It doesn't matter what country I'm living in, that's the same. It's universal. It extends beyond time and beyond place. It doesn't matter if I'm the king or I'm a peasant, right? It's universal. It applies to all people evenly. That's the universal theory. The relative theory says, Well, it depends, right? It depends on the time. It depends on the place. It depends on the culture. It depends on the religion. It depends on if you're male or female, black or white, right? It depends, right? It's a very dependent one. It's relative, right? It's relative to your race. It's relative to your gender. It's relative to your nationality, relative to your time in history, right? So you have these two extremes. One is things are true. The other is nothing is absolutely true. It's very relative, right? These are the two perspectives. To figure out where you stand on this matter, it often comes down to the question of veritas, or truth. What is truth? Right, now we're getting to the metaethics, right? What is truth? Well, there are different ways things can be true, right? Not getting into alternative facts, but there's different ways for things to be true. Like, I could say September 11th, 2001, the Trade Centers was attacked. That's true. Well, you could look to newspapers and stuff to confirm that, right? So that could be true from a historical perspective. I could also say, oh, I love my dog, right? I love my dog. Well, you're not going to find any record of that from a historical perspective. Does it mean then that I do not love my dog because there's no historical record of it? No, it can be both true that 9/11 happened, and it can be true that I love my dog, but they are true in a different way, right? One is based on an objective criteria of history, and one is based on my subjective experience, right? So both can be true, but in different ways. So this becomes a big issue. How do you determine what is true, and in what way, right? This is called epistemology, the study of knowledge. We often can get very divided on this because, as a culture, because some people think the only truth might be scientific truth, right? In that case, the humanities, things like art and culture and theater, and they're not true because they're not scientific. But they can be true in different ways, right? The truth of the human experience expressed in a play could be different than the truth of a microscope, but they can be true in different ways. Okay, this debate goes back a long way. What is true, and how do you determine what is true? So in the ancient world, there were these groups called sophists, and Plato was very much against sophists. Sophists believed that if you can convince somebody that something is true, then it's true. They were skeptics, right? They didn't really believe that anything was truly real or not. It's just, can you convince people of your perspective, right? People were professional sophists. It means they argued their point, right? They convinced you to follow whatever they believed through being eloquent with their language, appealing to your emotions, being a great speaker, right? A great debater. If they could convince you, then they won, right? In contrast, you had people like Plato or Aristotle, and they did not like sophists. For them, being a sophist would be a very bad insult. It was like a swear word to be called a sophist. They believed in truth, realism. They would say you should try to convince people eloquently, but it's not to deceive people into following your perspective by being very clever in the way that you speak. It's to present the truth. The truth matters. The truth exists. People should follow one belief system or another because it's true. And that's enough of a reason to follow it. This is realism. So going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, we have skepticism which doesn't really believe anything is true, but just convince people of your perspective. And then there's realism, which is based in reality, which they believe exists. This debate continues, right? For 3,000 years, we've been debating this. In the present, Middle Ages to the present time, we had, in the modern period, this debate. Aristotle is then turned into, in the Middle Ages, people like Thomas Aquinas or Averroes or Avicenna, coming from the Greek and Muslim and Christian perspectives from the Middle Ages, that believe in realism. This is brought from the time of Aristotle in the BC era all the way up until the modern period, which is about the 15 and 1600s. Out of this Middle Age period, out of this modern period, comes people like George Berkeley, Rene Descartes, David Hume. Hope I have a picture of Descartes again where Spinoza is, but Spinoza is pictured later, so you'll see his picture later. They all of a sudden rediscover Plato. They rediscover the sophists, and they start thinking along the same line as them. They start rejecting realism and going towards things like idealism, rationalism, and emotivism, Spinozaism. And I'll get into that in the next slide. So, again, it's just the ancient debate, just the truth or not. In the very modern period, you have people like Nietzsche, who would then say there are no eternal facts. There are no absolute truths. Again, this is the modern period. They're breaking away from realism to these idealisms, skepticism. But you can probably find the logical error within Nietzsche's statement. There are no eternal facts as there are no absolute truths. Well, if there are no absolute truths, is that true? Right? There are absolutely no absolute truths. Then that would be a false statement, right? It's a bit of a contradiction. If you say there are no such thing as truth, then is that true? People often can be relativists, saying that there's no absolute truth until it becomes a very serious matter. Then all of a sudden people immediately move towards this idea of universalism. People can say, well, it's all relative. It depends on the time. It depends on the place. It depends on the culture. It depends on the religion. Until you get to things like slavery in the Americas, right? Once it's slavery in Americas, based on American culture in the 1700s, based on the time, the place, the people, well, I guess slavery is perfectly ethical, right? It's ethical. It's a different time, it's a different place. Think about that. Do you agree that slavery in the Americas was ethical in the 1700s, in the 1800s, in the 1600s? Was it ethical? Well, I would say no. It was not ethical. Well, why is it not ethical? Because slavery is always wrong. You say, well, it was a different time. Well, it was wrong in that time. It was a different place. It was wrong in that place, right? We look to issues right now with the Taliban or ISIS, you could say, well, based on their time, and based on their place, based on their culture, based on their religious principles, there's nothing wrong with prohibiting women from being educated. Are you okay with that as a statement? If you are, you're a relativist. If you say, no, it's actually not okay. If you say, well, if it's not okay, why? Because it's never okay to oppress women. Right? Never okay to keep women from being educated like they're second-class citizens. If you believe that, okay, now you're a universalist, right? You believe in universal truths. So a lot of times we get very relativistic, right? I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're not going to tell me what to do. It's all relative, right? It depends on, a lot of things. But when it gets to serious things, we often get very absolute, right? We often get very universal. Back to the ancient debate, realism versus skepticism. Of course, I put myself in the way in this. I'm going to move myself up. Okay. When we look at realism, the image on the left here, the person sees a tree, and the tree is real, right? It's somewhat straightforward. A realist sees something, and they believe their eyes, right? They believe what they see. And if they have doubts of their eyes, they could go up and they could touch it. They could smell it. I guess you can rip a leaf off and put it in your mouth. You could taste it, right? I could ask somebody else, do you see a tree? Yep, I see a tree. Okay, we both agree there's a tree, right? We can trust the world around us. We can trust what we see. We can trust our senses. This is realism. Skepticism sees a tree and they go, I don't know. I have the dream of a tree, right? It could be a tree. It might not be a tree. All I have is the image of a tree in my mind. I don't know how it got there. I don't know if there's actually a tree in the real world. It could be a hologram. It could be something else. There's no way to know if there's actually a tree there. Well, that's skepticism. You don't trust what is directly in front of you. Now, there is some truth to skepticism. I'm a little bit harsh to skeptics, but there is some truth to skepticism. You know, if you're going for a walk and you see a tree on the side of the road, but that tree's not really your focus. You're focusing on the road. How much of our minds just fill in the gaps? Probably quite a bit, right? If I'm going down the road and I see a tree off to my right, I probably see green, side of the road, some type of bark, and my mind knows what a tree is. How much of my mind is just filling in the gaps with tree, right? Probably quite a bit, right? Even within our own house or within our own apartment or our dorm room, all of the stuff in it is ours. We know what it is. At one point, we probably held it and looked at it. But throughout the day, as we're moving about our space, we probably see to our left and the right all types of things, and our mind is just filling in the gaps from our memory, right? Lamp, table, floor, rug, right? We're not actually looking, right? We glance and we see it, but our mind fills in the gap. This is skepticism. But skeptics hold that to the end, right? Everything is like that. Everything is our mind filling in the gaps. We don't actually see anything, according to the skeptics. Realists say, no, we actually see it, right? It's really, really there, right? It's really there. It's not to say that when we drive down the road and we see a tree and we fill in the gaps with our memory, that we're not using our memory a little bit, but we will say, no, the tree is really there, right? The tree is really there. Part of this, I'll move myself again. Part of this relativism comes out of people like Berkeley. Berkeley was an Anglican bishop in England, and he has this idea of idealism. He says that all that exists are minds and their ideas. Physical objects are no more than a collection of sensations appearing on our minds. Now, that's not that wrong from a scientific perspective, and he's saying this in the 1700s, so it's not entirely wrong, right? We have light bouncing off of things which create an image in our mind. Is when I look at something, do you see the exact same thing? Well, that would be impossible to know because I don't know what you're seeing. I only know what I'm seeing, right? If we both, for example, look at this orange or mandarina, I know what I see. You might see something that looks like an apple from my perspective, right? It's impossible to know what another person is seeing. But realism would say, no, we probably are seeing the same thing, right? There would be no reason to believe that I'm seeing a mandarina and you're seeing an apple when we're both looking at the same object. We just have to trust our senses, according to realism. But according to idealism, none of it's really true. The problem, I guess, you would get to that would be once you start getting into ethics, which is where we now bring in David Hume into this, where it's emotivism. If nothing's really real, right? If it's all just in our minds, like The Matrix, for example, if you ever seen that movie, maybe some of the episodes from Black Mirror, you could see something like this. If it's all just in our heads, then nothing is really right or wrong, right? We don't even know that, even if we said murdering is wrong. Well, if even murder is just all in our heads, is it even wrong if it's just in our heads? How is waking reality any different than a dream? We're not unethical if we murder someone in our dreams. Essentially, living is like a dream, right? It's in our minds. So how could that be wrong, right? It creates an ethical problem. David Hume brings it to the next level, where he says that facts are just really our emotions, right? There's no such thing as facts. There's no such thing as reality. He says that reason is the slave of the emotions, right? We first feel something and then we create rules about it, right? We have a bad emotion about murder, and then we come up with reasons why we shouldn't murder, right? But the reasons follow the emotions, right? Something like very emotional, like rape or something like that. We would say first is our emotion of disgust about it, and then we rationalize why it's bad. But we're starting really with our emotions. He says that's really how people are ethical. They're just basically following their emotions, and then they come up with facts to support it. Now, that is true, that is how many people act. I think David Hume was onto something in terms of descriptive ethics, right? How many people today are, when you hear something politically, your emotions strongly guide you, right? If you're a Republican and you hear something that's against Nancy Pelosi, you probably like it, right? There's an emotional thing of, see, I told you she's not a trustworthy woman. Therefore, you agree with it before you even know the facts. And if you're a liberal, you hear something about Donald Trump that's terrible, you might think immediately, see, I knew he would, that's exactly what he's like, whether or not the facts back it up or not, right? First, we judge with our emotions, and then we judge with our rationality. That is how people act, right? It is how people act. But a realist would say that's not how we should act. Realists would say we should act according to reason, not our emotions. A realist says we have emotions, but we should shine the light of truth on them, right? We should shine the light of reason on them. And I think this is very, very important, right? If you were to think about most, I noticed from our week one, when people talked about ethical issues that they think were important, the biggest one was discrimination, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, something like that. I would say, and I put this in a lot of people's feedback, all of those types of discrimination really are emotionally driven, right? Maybe if a person were white and they didn't grow up around many people of color, Latino, Black, Native American, whatever other race, they might have fear of outsiders, right? If you grew up in an entirely single culture society, you might be afraid of outsiders. Your gut tells you not to trust outsiders. That's deeply, goes deep into our psychology, probably going way back to evolutionary advantages of not trusting outsiders. So, but then the response that you might have if you are simply following your emotions might be racist, right? You might judge somebody based on their skin color. Well, that would be wrong, right? Because now you've made a choice to follow, to do an action that was discriminatory or racist. If we were to have the emotion isn't intrinsically wrong, but when we shine the light of reason on it, when we are rational about it, we then would not judge people based on the color of their skin, right? So realism actually breaks us out of isms, right? Because it brings us to reality, right? Reality is better than living in isms, which is an ideology. Hope this isn't getting too confusing, but next step, cultural. Before I was dealing with kind of personal relativism versus impersonal universalism, we then can bring it into cultural relativism and cultural universalism. Can one culture be judged better or worse than another culture? We tend to, in our present modernist perspective, we are often very slow to criticize another culture, unless it's our own. We're very critical of American culture, but you would say, can we judge another culture? And as relativists, and most of us were raised in a relativistic society, we would tend to say, no, we cannot judge another culture. But a universalist would say, why not? Right? If you were to say, is it better to live under ISIS or the United States? A relativist would say, who are we to judge? But a universalist would say, no, America is clearly better than ISIS, right? There's freedom. You're not put to death for being a homosexual. Women have rights in this country, right? It is better. It's not just different, but one is better than another, right? That's a universalist perspective. We're often very slow to say that, but this is the debate. Now, people like the woman right over my shoulder here, Ruth Benedict, she is an ethical relativist, a cultural relativist. She says we can't judge one culture as better than another because cultures often get things wrong. So if we were to say, if we look at English colonialism, for example, English colonialism went around the world. It brought with it its culture, its economics, its religion, its everything, right? England brought itself with it when it was colonialist. But if we look at the English colonialism today, even with something as simple as homosexuality, you could have been put to death or given life imprisonment for being homosexual under the English system. But today we would see that as barbaric. So who is England to say that they're better than any of the cultures that they colonized when they were wrong on something, right? From modern perspectives. Therefore, who is England to claim to be superior to anyone, right? So maybe the cultures they inhabited were even more moral or better than England, right? So because of that, who are we to judge? That might get some sympathy, right? That might have some sympathy to it. But then we have people like James Rachel, who was at the top of that last page, and he said, well, that's not really true. And he was a universalist. He said we can look at ethics, and every culture is not different, right? Every culture is really not different when it comes to ethics. And he looked at the example of the Greeks versus the Calatins. When they asked the Greeks, how do you take care of your dead? They said, we burn the dead. We burn the dead. Cremation. That's the appropriate way. And when the Persian king asked the Calatins, how do you take care of your dead? They ate their dead, right? They were cannibalistic when it comes to their dead. Well, that's different, right? These are different. So he went back to the Greeks and he says, what do you think about eating your dead? They said, oh, that's disgusting. It's terrible. It's vulgar, right? And he went to the Calatins and he says, what do you think about burning your dead? They said, oh, that's disgusting. That's horrible. That's vulgar. So you would say, well, it looks like these two cultures are completely opposite in this regard. But then when the Persian king went and asked, why do you burn your dead? They said, well, out of respect for the dead, we burn the dead. And when he went to the Calatins, he said, well, why do you eat your dead? They say, out of respect for the dead. Well, so they look like completely opposite acts. But in principle, they're actually the same, because the principle is honor the dead, right? So both cultures honor the dead. So again, the act might be different, but the principle is universal. So no matter what culture you go to around the world, find a culture that does not honor the dead. It'd probably be very hard to find. I can't think of any cultures that do not honor their dead, right? So that's a universal thing. Another example was with what they called Eskimos, now Inuit people. When the elderly got too old to walk, they would often go off into the wilderness and freeze to death and die. Euthanasia. Or if a woman had too many children, she would leave a child out to die, freeze to death and die. You would say, see, these are different cultures, right? They have different ethics where they kill their elderly, they kill their children, right? There are different ethical principles. But James Rachel, when he looked at it, he goes, they're really not that different. So if you ask the Eskimo people, the Inuit people, well, why did the elderly go out into an ice drift and die? He said, well, to survive, for the whole tribe to survive, we have to walk miles and miles every day to secure housing, food, water. We need to be on the move. Otherwise, everybody's going to starve to death. So the elderly are willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the tribe, the sake of everyone. And how about the children, leaving children out? Well, if a woman has more children than she can carry, and there's nobody else who can carry her children, then she can't keep up. And she could slow everyone down if they waited for her, or she could fall behind and then her and her children will freeze to death. But either way, people are going to die, right? So she has to leave one behind because she can only have as many children as she is able to carry, because they have to move so much in order to survive as a people. So the underlying principle behind the Inuit people is the preservation of life. That they don't freeze to death and die as a people, either as a tribe or as a family. They don't die. So they are trying to preserve life, and the rest, everybody else is trying to preserve life. So the principle is the same. So what James Rachel is saying is there might be cultural differences, but we're not talking about relativism. We're not talking about different principles. Same principles, slightly different actions, right? So there's far less disagreement than what it seems. Therefore, it's not like saying, well, England has the universal ethical way of being and everybody else is wrong. He would say, everyone's basically, if you dig deep enough within each culture, principally, we are more often more alike than dissimilar, right? So ethics is in some ways innately, like from our creation, universal, right? There's a universal nature in all of us, right? Even if we were to look at places like ISIS, right? People are rebelling against it, right? The everyday person does not often like this type of thing, and right. There's a reason why people are fleeing to get out of countries run by the Taliban, right? They're trying to get out. Why? Because they don't want that, and they probably won't be able to maintain that type of control for very long, right? Maybe a few decades. But even if we look at China, how well is China able to hold on to totalitarianism? Not particularly well, right? They're becoming more Western than they are remaining Eastern in some ways. Now, lastly, and I know I've gone on for 40 minutes now, and this is to close it up, but who's winning, the Universalist or the Relativist? Again, I think I pointed out, since the Enlightenment, the relativists have generally been winning, right? The emotions over reason have been winning. The idea that we can't really think that anything is true has been winning, and that morally, who is anyone to judge anybody else? Everything is relative in terms of morality and ethics. They're winning. The Universalists are not winning. If we look at this poll from 3 years ago of the different generations, when asked, Is lying morally wrong, right? They ask people, is lying morally wrong? If you look at the elderly, 61% say that lying is morally wrong. Every subsequent generation says less and less that lying is morally wrong, right? Look down to Generation Z, only 34% say that lying is morally wrong, right? This is a sign of relativism, right? Maybe it's ethical to lie. It depends, right? This is relativism. Another one is 24% of Generation Z agrees that what is morally right and wrong changes over time based on society. Now, you have to be very clear with this one. It's not saying, does society change the way it thinks things are morally right and wrong? Descriptive ethics, right? What do people think about it? Of course that changes, right? What people think about things changes, right? Absolutely. Nobody's questioning that. But does the absolute truth change over time? And 24% says yes of Generation Z. This is clearly cultural relativism. Somebody comes at it from a universal perspective, this is a terrible thinking idea, because it would be saying, well, 100 years ago, women were not able to vote. Therefore, that was right 100 years ago, and today it's not right. Is that really true? Right? 200 years ago, slavery would be legal. Today, it's not legal. Well, they were right then. We're right now. Nobody's wrong. One of the challenges, again, to this relativism is, if you say every culture and every time is right in its own way, how does anything ever change, right? How does somebody like Martin Luther King make a moral statement against segregation, for example, right? Because if our view is different time, different place could be right, well then, I guess 1960s America, segregation could be right? And who is Martin Luther King to say it wasn't right, right? It was right for them then. Who is anyone from that? Who is anyone to say it's wrong today or then? The people who wanted to end slavery, right? Who are they to say that slavery was wrong? It was right then, right? It's right. If we were to be strong, determined with this relativist perspective, really society could never change at all, right? Could never evolve. Like anybody who says, this isn't right, we need to change this, would be wrong, because the culture would be right. It's only somebody who has a universalist perspective who could say, this is wrong, we should change this, right? But you say, well, everybody agrees that this is right. But a universalist could say, even if everyone agrees that something's right, it could still be wrong because universally it's wrong, right? It's an interesting perspective. It doesn't always mean that you know what universal truth is, but it recognizes that there is universal truth, which I think is an important thing. So in conclusion, what is global ethics? Global ethics looks at global issues. It deals with globalization. To be honest, this class is not particularly looking at these issues through a global perspective. A lot of the assignments are not focused on a global perspective, but that's the goal. And I think as classes move on, eventually this might become a global ethics class in a true sense, but it's only on its way there now. Normative theories of ethics are the types of ethics that tell us what we ought to do. Then we deal with questions of epistemology. What is truth, right? There are different types of truth, but what is truth, right? And is all truth valid, and in what way? Can we trust empirical knowledge? Can we trust what we see? Can we trust what's real, or is nothing real? Is it all skepticism? We can't trust anything on the outside world. And then when we relate that to ethics, is anything ethically right or wrong? Or is it all relative? Or is there such thing as universal truth when it comes to ethics? These are all questions to debate and discuss in your paper this week to an elected official. You're dealing with relativity versus universalism. I think it's easier to argue from a universal perspective of saying this is wrong because it's wrong, right? I think that's an easier argument, but I think you could also make a relativist argument that's saying for example, from the values of our culture, right? Maybe you live in the South, right? You live in the South in a rural town. From our rural Southern values, this is wrong, right? That would be a relativist approach. Or from our northern city life of Boston, right? This is wrong, right? I guess you could make those claims as well, but that would be how you would have to frame it. Okay, I hope you have a great week. I will make another video for week 3. I believe we're moving on to virtue ethics then. I will see you then.